We're actually on today's daf is daf Nun Tet 59, and we are at the bottom of Nun Chet Amud Bet because we didn't quite. We started the discussion, we didn't quite finish it. Please let me know if my sound's not so good. I hear it's not great, but and we've been discussing something which is pretty complicated, but very interesting, which is that it seemed pretty obvious to us when we started that if an animal goes and eats an apple, you pay back an apple, right? And that might be the case. We're going to actually discuss the produce today. The challenge is that very often what animals eat is attached to a plant, right? And so they walk into a field, and animals, of course, especially cows, I guess it's really true about many animals, they're not necessarily looking for the ripe tomato, they eat the whole vine, right? And the question is, how do you evaluate that kind of value when at the current time, it might not be worth very much, but it will grow into something. And by eating it, you've caused a lot of damage. But obviously, we don't generally make you pay for future damage, generally. So how do you evaluate that? So we said yesterday that there's this interesting pasuk that says that when an animal eats in a field, you pay based on the value within the field, right? Bistei acher is what we called it. Bi'er b'sidei acher. And we said that meant that you don't look at what it ate and what is the value of it ate. You look at what it ate within the context of a bigger field. So one explanation, there were many of them, is that it's what this field would be worth with this vine or without this vine, or with this row or without this row. What we're going to get to today is the question of how far does that extend? Meaning, what if there's already fruit on the vine, or grapes on the vine, or figs on the tree? Do you also look at is this just for the tree, or just for the shoots, or just for the finished product? So we're going to get into all of that. But the way we introduce that is through the case we had yesterday of a guy, a human, who cut down someone's date tree, right? This beautiful date tree. And they went to the Reish Galuta, and the Reish Galuta said, well, I've seen that date tree, and it's a group of three, and together the three cost $100,000. So you've got to pay $33,333, right? And then he said, that's ridiculous, because our Mishnah said you go within 60. And so he went to Rav Nachman, who said, okay, one of 60. And then Rava said, why? That's not the same as our Mishnah at all. And that's what we're up to. Amar le Rava, so I'm going to go to, which is 10 lines, 12 lines from the bottom. We'll go quickly. Im amru b'niskei mimono. Our Mishnah was talking about when your animal did damage. Yomru b'niskei gufo. Is it true that when you personally go and cut down someone's tree, it's the same as when your animal goes and eats the tree? So Amar le Abaye the Rava. So Abaye said to Rava, why is that a question? B'niskei gufo my daitach. Why do you think that niskei gufo, when a human causes damage, it's different? The Tanya, because you have the following Breita. And it's a side point, actually, Rav and Abaya. The key thing today is this Breita. So pay close attention. 9 lines from the bottom. The first word on a line says the Breita, right? Hamavkir karmosha chaveros smadar. A person causes damage, or this means he just destroys the whole vineyard of his friend when it is still, not his friend, or someone else, when it is smadar. Smadar means generally grapes that are starting off. It's like an early stage, unripe grapes. They're not edible at that point. They're going to become edible if they keep growing, but you wipe out the whole vineyard. So the question is, how do you evaluate that damage, right? Because again, the vineyard would have had a lot of grapes. At the end of the season, they'd be worth, $1 million. I don't know. Now they're not worth that at all because you can't sell smadar, but you cause that damage. Says the Breita, what you do is, roanoto kama yafeh kodem lechen. You evaluate the vineyard as a whole, and you say, how much was someone willing to buy this vineyard for? This is Rashi's understanding. How much is it worth after you've ate these grapes? And that's what you pay. And what the Breita doesn't mention is anything about 60. Ilu b'shishim lo katani. It doesn't say anything about evaluating it within a vineyard that has 60 times. So what you see from here, presumably, is that when you talk about human damage, you don't do this whole evaluation into one of 60. So that seems to be the question. Says Abaya, that's no question. Because by Behemto, we have the exact same Breita with the same language, and clearly the Breita is just not mentioning that detail. Atugabi Behemto nami milo tanya ki hagavna. Don't we have the exact same language and formulation of a Breita by animal damage to Tanya? What is this equivalent Breita by an animal? Again, 6 lines now from the bottom with the star. Katmanitia. Let's say an animal cuts down, it eats or chews down a sapling. Right? So again, this is a sapling. It's going to one day produce a lot of fruit, but today it doesn't produce anything, right? So how do you evaluate that? So Rabbi Yossi said, the truth is that you could do some kind of valuation, But because it's very subjective and very, potential damage, they made up sort of fixed amounts. Rabbi Yossi says, Gozrei Gezerot Shebushalayim Omrim, the rule makers, right? They had a Beit Din, the Gemara elsewhere talks about who these people were, who made Gezerot in Yerushalayim. They made a blanket rule. Nitya bat shnata. If you have a sapling that's in its first year, which again is not going to produce anything for a long time, but has future value. If you cut that down, that's shtei kesef. You got to pay 2 kesef. If it's bat shtei shnanim, if it's in the second year, so it's already established itself, it's a little bit more, then you pay arba'a kesef. You pay 4. And these are, Rashi understands to some extent elsewhere that these are gzeirot, like a knas. You pay 4 kesef. But the part of the Braita that's important to us is the next words. Achla chaziz. Let's say your animal eats chaziz. Chaziz is like the beginning of the shoots of the grain that come up. I don't really know English words for a lot of this stuff, but it eats, these are like just the beginning part of the grain that's not yet wheat, right? It doesn't have anything yet that's valuable, but it's certainly edible for animals. So you eat this chaziz. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, you know how you value the cost of that? You don't look at how much is chaziz worth, because chaziz is worth very little. What you do is you're nidon b'mishuyer shabo. What you do is you look at what's left behind, meaning let's say the animal ate half the field. You wait for the other half of the field to grow for a full season. At the end of the season, you look at the other half of the field and you say, how much is this grain worth? $10,000. So you got to pay me $10,000 for what your animal ate, or whatever amount of money. But meaning you look at the future value, and the way you figure out a future value is by looking at how much something grew, right? You have to have a test case. Now, it's really complicated. What if the animal ate the whole field? But let's deal with this case, right? You look at what's left behind. The Chachamim Omrim say, like we said before, that's not the way you look at it at all. Ro'en oto kama hayta yafa. You look at the field and say, how much is the field worth when it had this kind of growth cover over the whole field. The kama hi yafa, and how much is it worth now that the animal ate a portion of the field? And you go from there. Now, what we're going to ask in a minute is that no one's mentioned anything about a 60th, right? So that's going to be the question that Abai is asking, that it's both by humans and by animal. We seem to have left out that detail. But before we ask the question, let's finish the Braita on top of Mem Nun Tet, Amud Aleph. Says the Braita, what if you're achlas smadar? What if an animal eats grapes? Now, this is very equivalent, right? Smadar, early immature grapes that are similar to the early grain. So Rabbi Yeshua says, well, what you do is ro'in otan kilo hein anavim omdot li batzer. You have to look at these as if they are mature grapes about to be picked, right? So meaning you look at the future, you say this animal ate 20 vines worth of grapes, maybe ate the vines too, but ate the grapes also. And these grapes now are worth very little, but as they mature and plump up, they're going to be worth much more. And that's what you have to pay. You deprived him of 20 vines worth of grapes. And the Chachamim say, no, you don't look at the future value. Ro'in Kamma hayta yafa. How much were these vines and the field worth before? The Kamma hi yafa, now they've been eaten, and you pay the difference. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon, which seems to be very similar to the first opinion, but we'll ask that in a second. The Medvar Memurim, when do you say, according to the Chachamim, that you look at the whole vineyard and you say how much was the vineyard worth before and how much is it worth now? That's bizman she'achla lulavei gefanim v'chure te'inim. That's if the animal ate not the grapes, but the actual lulavei gefanim, right? I know you translate. I mean lulavim, right? You ate the branches basically of the vine. So meaning it chewed up not necessarily the product, but the precursor, right? You have shoots coming out that are gonna have grapes on them, and the animal went away and chewed that whole thing away. Yichure te'inim are the equivalent in a date, right? It's not a date, in a fig. Right? So meaning an animal ate away the part of the tree that was going to become the fruit, right? So that's where you can't say you have to pay a fruit because it didn't even eat a fruit. There wasn't even a geffen there. There wasn't even a grape. But you pay the cost of the field, eaten or not eaten. If the animal eats fruit that is already growing, now pagim and boser, remember, unripe grapes, and unripe pagim are figs, right? So now, but it's a later stage than smadar. Then, since they're already growing, even though they're not yet ripe, you should evaluate it as if it's ready to be picked. So Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, we're going to see, might be a middle opinion that you don't look at necessarily the entire worth right now. You look at some future worth, but that's only true if there's already a grape or already a fig that's growing on that tree. So that's the Breita. We're going to get back to and analyze the Breita. But the question that Abaya asked to Rava was Katani Mihat. However, if you quote the Chachamim, the middle part, Chachamim Omrim, the Chachamim say, Ro'eno tan kama hayta yafeh. You see how much the field was worth before the animal ate from it. But kama hi yafeh, and how much is it worth now that the animal ate? But you don't mention anything about Shishim. Lo katani Shishim. It doesn't say anything about 60. Now, why doesn't it? Our Mishnah clearly said 60, or said something like that. Elamai yitlach l'meimer. What are you going to say? That it's taken for granted that b'shishim, right? Meaning we didn't speak out that detail because we understand the detail. That you evaluate how much the field was worth and how much is it worth now, but not on a very micro field level. You evaluate it within a larger 60 times the damage that was done or 60 times the field. So if that's the case, you can't prove from a person that a person doesn't pay the 60 because the Breita didn't say it. It didn't say it by an animal either. It must be, it's just assumed. And if it's assumed, hachanami b'shishim. So here too, by a human, you can assume that it also means in 60. And so therefore, says, going back to our original case from yesterday, when you cut down the palm tree, the Reish Galuta said, pay the value of the palm tree. Rav Nachman came and said, don't pay the value of one palm tree or 3 palm trees. Look at a field of 60 palm trees and look at a field of 59 palm trees and pay the difference between those two things. So that's how we go. And we're going to see later today how we paskin, in case you're wondering if you cut down a palm tree. Amar Abaya. Now says Abaya today, to continue, and again, we're going to get back to this very important Breita. Says Abaya, the fact is, taking you way, way back to earlier in, excuse me, I think I lost the place. Oh, there we go. Amar says Abaya, how do we understand this concept of future payment, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili? In fact, that's very similar to what Rabbi Yishmael said earlier about how you understand payment for a field that's damaged. Says Abaya to now, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who just said before that if an animal eats immature grapes, you don't pay back immature grapes, or you don't pay back the damage to the field, you pay back mature grapes, the value of these grapes when they're going to be in their best condition. Rabbi Yossi Aglili's comment and Rabbi Yishmael Amru Davar Echad. That's the same thing Rabbi Yishmael said earlier. We're going to quote it in a second. What is that? Rabbi Yossi Aglili Hadamarn. So we just said. If an animal eats not only grapes, right, but even an animal eating, well, maybe only grapes. Animal eating early immature fruit, you pay as if it's going to be mature, what it's like at the end of the season. Rabbi Yishmael, what was Rabbi Yishmael? The Tanya. Now we had earlier in the Masechtet for many days a big debate between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva about how to understand when the Torah says that if an animal does damage, it says, and now we're quoting Titania, Meitav Sadeu, Meitav Karmo Yishalim. Right? It's a pasuk. You pay back the best field, the best vineyard. So the question is, what does the best mean? So we said earlier, Rabbi Yishmael said, Meitav Sadeu Shel Nizak. It means the best quality field that the person who was damaged owns. Meitav Karmo Shel Nizak. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Right? Now, we didn't understand exactly what that meant. What does it mean, the best value of the field? Let's say I've been damaged and I have 3 levels of field, A, B, and C, and you come and damage level B. This pasuk implies you got to pay back from level A, right? According to Rabbi Yishmael. And we asked before, why? Right? You didn't cause damage at level A. But we'll put it aside for a second. Rabbi Akiva said, no, it has nothing to do with the person who was damaged. Lo ba katuv ela ligvot lenizakin min ha'idit. It's telling you that, no. When you pay back damage, let's say you caused $1,000 of damage, you can't pay back $1,000 in a mediocre field. You've got to pay back $1,000 in quality grade A real estate, which is what we call idit, right? And Rabbi Akiva said, kavachomer lehektesh, if you cause damage to hektesh. So now, we didn't understand what Rabbi Shmuel said. We understood Rabbi Akiva, right? Meaning it's the best quality of the mazik, of the one who caused damage. Meaning when you pay in that field. But we didn't understand what it meant. What does it mean, the best quality of the nizak? You don't have to pay for a better field than you damaged, right? So now, we had an answer earlier of Ravidi Bar Oven. Says the Gemara now, but that no longer seems to be adequate. Lo tema Ravidi Bar Oven. Don't tell us that it's like Ravidi Bar Oven. If you recall, what Ravidi Bar Oven said before, we had this, I taught, I remember one Sunday morning, I think. Damar Ravidi Bar Oven, Kigon Sh'achla Aruga Bein HaRugot. The machloket is where an animal came into someone's field and ate a row of produce. And what you don't know is whether it was a good quality row or a bad quality row, right? V'lo yadinan ikechusha havi, if it was very weak, right? So inferior quality and therefore worth, say, $100. O shmeina havi, or it was a very good quality row and therefore it's worth $200. And so you don't know. And that's where maybe Rabbi Yishmael comes and says, look, you got to look at the rest of the field and you got to pay according to the best thing in the field because you have to assume that maybe it was the best quality. The Amar kum shalem shmina b'meitav dika hashta. Look at what the best that's left behind, and maybe this row is as good as the next best row in the field, and you have to pay that. Now, don't look at the worst row in the field. The hachilo amina, don't say that, right? That's wrong. Why? Why is that wrong? My taima, because I'm motzi mechaver lav haraya. Because if I wanted you to pay me for damage, I have to prove that you owe me that damage, right? That's the principle that we go with everywhere, that you have to prove that you are owed the damage. And so I can't collect the best quality if you damage something unknown and it might have been worse quality. So that is not the answer. What is that? So that, I mean, that's what Ravidi Ravan thought the answer was. But says Gemara now, we're arguing with that, right? And we are arguing, this is Abaya is arguing and saying, you know what Rabbi Yishmael really meant? Rabbi Yishmael meant, my ni ella b'meitav delikame. What Rabbi Yishmael meant is that you have to pay with the best that is in front of him. My nihu, and what is that? Kihech desalik. You have to look at what's left behind. Meaning, this animal ate a row of immature grapes, let's say. We don't know how much those immature grapes are going to be worth because you don't know how the harvest is going to turn out, right? You don't know if it's going to be a good season, if it's going to be dry, if it's going to be wet, if it's going to grow. How do you figure that out? Says Rabbi Yishmael, this is how Abaye understands Rabbi Yishmael. Says Rabbi Yishmael, what you do is you basically wait till the end of the season. You look at the other grapes or other grain or whatever it ate that's in that equivalent row or equivalent field, and you see what turned out. And you can say, well, had this animal not eaten this row of grapes, right, it would have matured into a row of Class C, I don't know how you evaluate grapes, but whatever, Class C, Merlot grapes, and it would have been worth $5,000, and that's what you have to then pay. So this is a whole new explanation of Rabbi Yishmael. Tosfos understands it's actually not new, it's added. It's a second part of Rabbi Yishmael, that when we say meitav sadeo of the nizak, it means you have to wait, like Rabbi Yossi Aglili said, and look at what was left behind and see what value it had and pay back the value based on that future growth of the thing that was damaged by the animal. Which is
what happens if he sold the field in the meantime?
Well, so again, it doesn't matter who owns the field, right? It matters what the future value is going to be of the field. So even if someone else owns it, you can still, this is basically agricultural value. It's not a human, it's not based on the person. I think the question that I mentioned earlier, which I left open, is what if there's nothing left, right? What if you ate the whole field? Or what if the field was destroyed or was knocked down or something? So, and that gets to a very tricky question where, how individual, like, can you look to a different field? Right? How personal is the value? Is it because I weeded and I hoed and I put this manure in? How does it affect another field? And so actually Tosfos discusses in a little bit, about how different products, different crops might have different values. Because for example, he says that grapes are much more reliable. That if you have a grape vine or grape, vineyard, you'll have sort of more uniform value throughout the whole vineyard. If one row does something, every row will do it. But with grain, it's very different because with grain, it could very well be that one section will get blight and one section won't get blight. And so there's much more variability. So you'd have to take that all into account. I'm no farmer, so anything else I say about this should be taken with a grain of salt. Okay, continues the Gemara. Let's go back and understand this Braita in a little bit more detail. And we are up to, where are we up to? Amar Mar, right? Which is, I guess, around halfway. It's the first word on the line. Amar Mar, Rabbi, so now quoting back the Braita that we started with earlier today, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda said, a third opinion. Rabbi Yossi Aglili was the first opinion who said you go with the future value. The Chachamim said, forget about future value. You just look at the value of the field. How much is the field worth with these immature grapes? How much is it worth without them? Then we came to a third opinion. Amar Amar, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda said, Mishum Rabbi Shimon, b'med dvarim emurim, when is it true that you basically look at the value of the field, not the value of what you ate? That's where the animal ate, not the fruit, right? Not the grapes or the figs, but the shoots that were going to lead to those grapes and figs. So you basically ate the tree. So therefore, there's no value yet in the fruit, or no direct value. But the implication is, hasmadar, that if you ate the very earliest, smadar is the very earliest little buds, not buds, but little grapes that grow on a tree, then you would actually look at that on your vine, you would look at that as future value. You would look at those as mature grapes and pay a higher value, like Rabbi Yossi said. But then Ema Seifa, look at the next thing he said, which was, if the animal ate pagim or boser, now boser, and pagim is the equivalent in a fig, a boser is the next level after smadar. After it matures from smadar, which is really just an unedible early grape, boser is an early grape that is somewhat edible, but not mature. So that implies that if you eat a more mature grape, rowan oto, kilo anavim amdot libatzer, that's where you look at it as if it's already mature. But implying hasmadar, if it was a very immature grape, that's like the shoots. Then you go like the chachamim, and you see how much the tree is worth or the field is worth with it or without it. So how do you explain that? Says Ravina, you're right. Kroch v'tani. You have to sort of, kroch means you tie it together, meaning you have to sort of use your imagination a little bit and put words in to explain it. Meaning, what we were really saying, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Mishum Rabbi Shimon, is now. Add these words. The medvar memurim. When do you? These are words in the Mishnah, but this is how you explain it in the Breita. The medvar memurim, that you pay the value of the field. It's where the animal ate the very early, not even fruit, but the shoots that were going to lead to the fruit. Madar. If it eats something that's already a product, for example, early grapes or pagim, boser, or the next level, meaning we bundle it all together, then roan otan kilo anavim umdot ibatzer. Then you view it as if basically it is already a fruit that's growing, and you look at it and you determine how much a mature fruit would cost, and that's what you pay. Says the Gemara, okay, but Ihachi, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Hainu Rabbi Yoshua. This Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda and Rabbi Yoshua are saying the exact same thing. They're both saying that once an animal eats a fruit, even if it's a very immature fruit, you have to give it future value and look at what it would be worth in the market once it's mature and pay that back. So what's the difference between them? Says the Gemara, you're right. They seem to say the exact same thing, and we don't know the difference. But I can tell you logically what the difference is. And the difference between them on the last now narrow line, Ika benayo kachash gufna. The difference between them is the weakness of the geffen, geffen is not necessarily a gufna here, but Rashi understands gufna, but it means the object itself. Meaning, so my animal ate, let's say it ate, I don't know, 2 rows of immature grapes. Okay. Over time, if those grapes grew and they became mature and you sold them in the market, you might sell them for $5,000, right? It's a lot of grapes. Obviously, today they're worth much, much less than that. But the thing is that not only so then I pay you $5,000, but the reality is that since my animal ate these grapes now, and they didn't grow on the vine for 3 more months, the vine itself is actually much more valuable, right? Because at every time you grow something on a vine, it depletes the vine a little bit, right? It uses up energy. There's a lifespan, right? So a vine can't grow grapes forever. Vines age out. Now, I don't know anything about vines, so everything else I'm going to say I can make up. But let's say it's 30 years or something, or whatever, whatever number of harvests you get with a vine. If this animal ate it early, right, then basically I saved my vine a year of work, and that it gives more value to the vine. So the question is, what do you do about that? So one opinion is forget about it. It's a collateral. But the other Tana seems to hold that you subtract that value from what I have to pay you. So instead of saying I pay you a vine worth 5 vines worth of grapes, I pay you 5 vines worth of grapes minus the strength of the vine that I saved you from by eating the grapes before they grew for 3 more months. Now, again, you have to obviously know agriculture to evaluate these things, but I'm sure there's a market. Everyone who knows this, especially probably Rashi, could have assessed that, right? So that is the difference between them. But says the Gemara, Lo Mesaimi, we don't know which person holds what because they don't say anything about it. But that must be the area that they disagree about. Abaye says, I agree with you, but Masaimi umasaimi. I know exactly who says what, right? There's no question about that because there's another Breita where we talk about the question of kachash gufna. It's a challenging Breita. We're going to do it. Man tana dechayesh the kachash gufna. Who is a tana who elsewhere explicitly says that when you pay someone for damage you do, you subtract from that damage the value that you basically save them from otherwise being damaged. We'll see let me give the example real quickly because I don't like the first example, but Gemara does it anyways. But the one example that Gemara is going to give in a second is childbirth, right? So a person damages a pregnant woman and kills her fetus, right? So you got to pay. So obviously there's a cost, and we figure out what that cost is and the value, and that's a discussion. But says the Gemara, we're going to talk about in a second. If you cause a woman to miscarriage, she no longer has to go to the doctor and pay for delivery, right? So you're basically end up subtracting the cost that you quote unquote saved her from doctor's bills because you caused her to miscarriage, right? So obviously it seems pretty unfair, but the point is that net cost you pay according to one Tana only for what you did minus what they ended up saving, quote unquote, from what that person was going to have to pay had you not done what you did. So that's the case that we'll get to in a second. The first case we get to is a little more challenging, which is the Tanya, at the end of the first wide line, a case of rape. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer Mishim Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, and this is why we're quoting it, because it's Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda. Ones, if a person is ones, is ma'anes, rapes a woman, so the Torah talks about damages you pay. But among the damages you pay, you have to pay tsar. Like any person who damages another person, right? You pay 5 different kinds of damage, right? Nezek, tsar, shevet, ripoy, and boshet. The same thing obviously is true about a rape, which is a physical attack. And you have to pay, besides the knas, which is something else, right? You have to pay, and we'll talk about this a lot later, but you have to pay all the damage. You hurt the woman, you caused her to have to go to the doctor, you not to work, etc. So you have to pay all of those regular damages. But says Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, Mishum Reb Shimon ben Menasya, you don't pay the tsar of ruining her virginity. So there's pain involved in breaking her betulim, right? In the first time she has intercourse. You don't have to pay that damage. Why? Because that is a pain that she would have ultimately experienced in her life when she got married and slept with her husband. And so since it's inevitable that she's going to have that tsar, you can't say that the rapist has to pay for that because although he caused that tsar, it's a tsar that she would have eventually had anyways. And so you don't have to pay for it. Amrullah, the Chachamim said to him, that's ridiculous because it's true that maybe she would have had that tsar at some point when she's in a relationship and getting married. But obviously the pain is different when it's done willingly than when it's done forced. You can't compare an action that was done with force and violence to an action that was done biratzon with willingness. So therefore, it's not equivalent. And again, that's a whole different discussion about how you view that. But the point that Reb Shimon Yehuda seems to be making is that when you evaluate damage that a person causes, you have to look at what of the damage would have happened inevitably or would have come down the road anyways. And you subtract that kind of damage from what you end up having to pay. And it's the same thing here. Says Abaya, Hani Tanai, these Tanaim and Reb Shimon ben Yehuda amru davar echad. In fact, Reb Shimon ben Yehuda seems to say that as well. Reb Shimon ben Yehuda hadamar, we just quoted Reb Shimon ben Yehuda who said that you don't pay for future damage. That would have happened anyways. Who are Hani Tanai? Who are these other Tanaim? Mahi. The Tanya, Rabbi Yossi ben Omer, Rabbi Yossi says that, and this is where the case I mentioned earlier, if a person damages a pregnant woman and causes her to miscarriage her fetus, right, you have to pay damages. But says Rabbi Yossi, Nechi Chaya, you subtract the cost of the midwife. Because since she didn't have to deliver, couldn't deliver, because you caused her to miscarriage, you don't have to pay for a midwife. And so you subtract that from your payments. And Benazai says, Nechi Mizonot, a woman who's pregnant who carries to term, Russian since either carries to term or after she gives birth, we understand elsewhere you have to give extra to nurse a kid, that you pay a lot more money in food. So you subtract the amount that you would have otherwise paid for food that you no longer have to pay, the extra money. Says the Gemara, Manda Amar Nechi Chaya, if you say that you subtract the amount for a midwife, you certainly subtract the amount for food. Why? Because we're going to see in a second that a midwife is not necessarily required. Some women can give birth without a midwife. So it's not always the case that you have to pay doctor's bills, right? Manda amar nechi mizonot. But if you say that you can subtract food, alva nechi chayalo, then you don't subtract doctor's bills. Damar lay, because he can say, the one who was damaged can say, itita didi pekichahi. My wife is very, usually translated as smart, but obviously smart does not mean high score in the SAT here, right? It means accomplished or successful in able to manage her own health, and therefore my wife would be able to give birth in the bathtub without a chaya. Let me buy a chaya. She wouldn't need a midwife, and so I wouldn't have had to pay for that anyways. And so you don't
Foreign
subtract.
translates it as capable.
Okay, so it's a good translation. Rav Papa, Rav Huna, Yeshua, Avad of the Kavati, Rav Nachum B'Shishim. Going back off of this topic, Rav Papa and Rav Huna, they actually had a circumstance similar to the case we had earlier. Someone cut down a tree or cut down something, and they poskin that you pay 1/60th, meaning you don't look at what one tree costs, you look at what 60 cost, and you pay 1/60th of that 60 tree value. Lishnachrina, some have it actually that you have to look at the land as well. Rav Papa, Rav Huna, Rav Yeshua, Samu, Dikla, Agav, Katina, Da'ara, they evaluated a tree on top of, meaning relative to the amount of land that it was on, which is the same thing that we understand. The Hilcha Kavate, the Rav Papa, the Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua. The halacha is in fact like Rav Papa and Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua, but specifically by a Dikla Da'arma, an Aramean Dikla, right? Now Rashi understands that's a lower value dekel, standard dekel, where basically if a person knocks down a palm tree, you don't pay back the value of one palm tree. You look at how much 60 times this would cost, and then you pay 1/60th of that. But the Hilchata Kavate de Reish Galuta, halacha is like the Reish Galuta who said you pay the intact value, but dikla parsa'a. When you're talking about a Persian palm as opposed to an Aramaic palm, which we usually equate those things, right? But Persian palm trees are, as Rashi puts it, chashuv hu ma'od. These are very, very notable Persian trees, like you see, nowadays, they're very valuable trees. And there you actually pay the intact thing. You don't pay 1/60th, you pay the whole thing because it's something that has its own value, maybe it's sold on its own and has its own status. Now, okay, that is the halacha. Again, the question of what's considered to be Persian palm tree, what's considered to be an Aramean palm tree, whether you look at a car one way or the other, of course, will depend on the circumstance. Now, just to add at the end of our this complicated daf, a very interesting story. There was a young guy, he might not be young, but he was called Eliezer Ze'era, which means Eliezer the younger, right? Or the smaller, I guess how you translate Ze'era. So Eliezer, not Rabbi Eliezer, Eliezer Ze'era, turn the page, was a very, let's say he was a very righteous person, and he thought he was very righteous, and he felt very sad about Jewish history, and so he was observed mourning all the time.
Interesting.
Wear black shoes, and that was unusual. Now Tosis is bothered because usually people wear black shoes, and it's not so uncommon. Everyone wears black shoes, but Tosis understands it means that not only was he wearing black shoes, but he was wearing black shoelaces. So he didn't have any flair, as they say, right? And so he was really showing that he was mourning. And so he would wear his black shoes. He stood in public with like a sign, woe to us, the world is coming down. So so the people from the government found him. They said to him, what are you doing? Maishna hani misane. Why are you wearing these black shoes, right? Sane means shoes, right? Why are you wearing black shoes? Amalei said, I'm terribly depressed because the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed 300 or 400 years ago. I'm relay, or you could say because of what's happening today, in his time, and obviously you could say the same today, unfortunately. I'm sad about things that are happening. So Amrulay, they said to him, what, you're like this special guy that the whole world is going on and you can't function because you're so conscious of what's going on. At chashivta litabile Yerushalayim, you're so chashiv that you can't function because you have to mourn about Yerushalayim. Savor yuharahavi. They thought that his guy is full of himself. He's stuck up. And so Atyu v'chavshuos, they imprisoned him. They went and they arrested him because he's ruining the whole society. Next thing you know, no one's gonna work on Tuesday because they're mourning about Jerusalem. You gotta fit in with society, according to this Gemara. Don't listen too much, Rosa. Amrulay, so he said to them, 1 second. You can't assume that I'm just a regular person with some crazy complex. Gavra Rabbana, I'm a great person, which is of course what an insane person would say, right? So I'm a great person. I'm mourning on Jerusalem because I have greater consciousness and awareness, and to me it's a big deal. It's not. I'm allowed to do this. Amalei said to him, well, Menaya Dinan, what are your credentials, right? How do we know that you are a person of uncommon intelligence and consciousness and awareness? How do you prove that to us? So he said, look, how am I going to prove that to you? Amrullah said to them, O aton bo mine milta, listen, either ask me any question, open the dictionary, open the Wordle, I can figure it out. Oh, as we've seen several times already, a better way to prove you're smart is ana ibai minaychu milta. Let me ask you. I bet you I could stump you with a riddle, right? So I can show you how smart I am. And this is obviously not smart in random knowledge, but smart in halacha. So Amrullah, they said to him, okay, we don't want to ask you questions, no trivia here, but Iyat, why don't you ask us a question and show us how knowledgeable and smart you are? So Amrullah always said to them, I'm not sure what everyone else in this room, we could do a New Year's Eve party trick, figure out what you would ask people. But Rosie could do that tonight. But he said to them, listen, I got a question for you. You know what the question is? Hi man de cuts kufra. Listen, think of this very complicated question. A person goes up to a palm tree and he cuts down a cluster of flowering shoots, right? It's a kufra, the immature palm branches that they're, you've seen them before they become the dates, right? So they're starting to flower. There's gonna be hundreds of dates from here. You cut it all down. My mishalim, what do you pay? So Amrullah said to them, well, you just pay the value of what you cut down, or you pay the value of these immature dates. So he said to them, but that doesn't seem fair. Hahavi Tamri, they're going to turn into these beautiful, delicious, amazing, valuable dates. This guy ruined thousands of dollars of future produce. How could you get away by paying for a bunch of immature things? They said, oh, it's a good point. Amrullah, Mishalim Demei Tamri. So you're right. Maybe you should pay the value of the future dates. Amrullah said to them, but that's not fair either. Halav Tamri Shakamine. He didn't cut down dates. He cut down immature things. So I don't know how you pay. It seems very complex. This stumped them. So Amrullah said, you're right. How in the world? Now, of course, this seems like a very obvious event. So they couldn't quite figure out, how do you assess damage when you break down, when you cut, when you eat, or you cut down someone's immature produce? So Amrullah said to him, okay, Imalanat. So why don't you tell us how you would do it, right? What's the answer? Amrullah said, you know what the answer is? The answer is this complicated Mishnah, B'shishim, that you can't look at the value of only these dates. You can't look at the future value. What you have to do is you look at this within the context of a bigger field. And you say, imagine there's 60 times this, which is what our mission teaches, and you value this within that context. So you don't end up paying just this tiny thing. You don't end up paying just the future value or the entire future value. You pay something in the middle. So that was a very elegant answer. And they were very impressed. But you know what they didn't like is, how do they know he's right? Amrullah man amar kavotech. That sounds great, but maybe you made the whole thing up, right? How do we know that where'd you pull this 60 out of your, it's great. It's a beautiful answer, but how do we know you're right? We're in the first wide line. So Amrullah said to him, well, you got to go check the experts. Shmuel Chai. This, I guess, was the time that Shmuel was alive. Shmuel is still living in Naharda, right? Ubeitino Kayam, and Shmuel's got his court. Shmuel's got his offices. Go and ask them. So they did. Shadru Kamei to Shmuel. They sent a message to Shmuel. They told him the case. Amrullah said to him, this guy is entirely right. Shaper Kamar Lechu B'shishim. What he told you is exactly correct. You pay B'shishim, and Shavku, they freed him to go and mourn for Jerusalem because they accepted that he was a wise person. So it's a good thing he showed up for Daf Yomi. Continues the Gemara. It's a very nice story to sum up our Gemara. Let's continue. We're at the 2 dots, the second wide line. We'll finish till the Mishnah. Maybe we can even go past. It's fast. Rabbi Shimon said in the Mishnah, that if you eat mature grapes, this is back to our original Mishnah, then you pay Perot Gemurim. My time, why? Why don't you pay in the value of the field? Because right? Remember the pasuk said that you collect based on a field. Says the Gemara, but that's only true. That's only a fruit that still needs the field to grow. And if you took away the field, it would die. Hani, mature fruits, kivan lo tzricha l'sadeh, since they don't need the field because they're ripe already, ba'inu, but be'einayu ba'al l'shlumi, you pay the current value. Amar Rav Huna bar Chia, Amar Birmi bar Abba, Dan Rav ki Rabbi Meir. Rav once paskin, now he was done in his Beit Midrash, like Rabbi Meir, we'll see the halacha in a second. El pasak hilchot Rabbi Shimon, and he paskin in our Mishnah, like the Rabbi Shimon we just quoted. What's the case of Rabbi Meir? Dan Rav ki Rabbi Meir, Titania. There's a braita which we had earlier in Ketubot. It says, let's say a person has a get, not a get, a ketubah for his wife. And his ketubah is 200 shekel, and it's mishubah to a field, right? The field is what you're going to pay back with. And the husband goes to his wife and he says, I want to sell the field. You have to sign off because your ketubah is beholden to this. And she says, I'm not signing off on you selling the field. That's what I'm going to collect my ketubah from. So Titania, the Braita says, Katav the Rishon, a man writes his field to sell it to a first person, below chatmalo, but his wife does not agree to sign. She does not co-sign, and therefore he can't sell the field. But then 5 years later, or 2 years later, the Sheni, he writes the field to a second person, the Chatmalo, and this time she signs, right? And then the husband dies, and there's no field because he sold it. Ibda Ketubata, she loses her Ketubah because she signed it off. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says, no. Yicholah hi shetomar, the woman, the wife can say, Nachat ruach asiti the Baali, right? I was just trying to be nice to my husband. I didn't want to anger him. So it's not fair. He pressured me to sign it, and I signed it because he made me. Atem malchem alai. You can't come to me and hold me accountable for that. So Rabbi Yehuda says that you can never hold a woman accountable for that. But Rabbi Paskin, like Rabbi Meir here, that if there was one time where she said no to him, then she'll stand up to her husband. And therefore, the second time, you can assume that she really wanted to do it, and she just has regret now. So that's the first case where Rav Paskin like Rabbi Meir. Upasak Yochatak Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi also Paskin like Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah. Hiaditznan, this is our Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon Omer Achla Perot Gmurim Mishalemet Perot Gmurim. If you eat perot that are finished, meaning they're ripe, you pay fruit that's ripe. And if you're and that is imsa'a sa'a, imsatayim, depending on whatever the value of the produce is. We take one minute to do the next Mishnah. It's not going to take long, I promise. Okay, we get 1 minute, I get, because we've learned this many times before. This is not different. We actually, even yesterday, we talked about this. It says the Mishnah, Hamagdish b'toch sdei chavero. Let's say a person puts a hay pile, a gadish, right, into the middle of his field, shlo b'reshut. I harvest my hay. I don't want to put it in my field. I put it in your field without permission. And then the guy's animal eats it. Achaltam behemto shel ba'al sadeh, patur, of course, because why'd you put it in my field? Vim huska b'hem, but if that animal was damaged by eating it or by falling on it, Bala Gadish Chayav, then the person who put down his Gadish in someone else's field has to pay. He caused damage. But if it was done with permission, then the Bala Sadeh has to pay for anything that was damaged because he basically accepted responsibility to watch it. Says the Gemara, why is that true? That goes against Rebbe. The Rebbe, Ha'amar Rebbe said, Achi kabel lav balabait l'shmar. That you have to say, not you're allowed to put it in my field, but you have to say, you can put it in my field and I accept to watch it. That's the only time you're chayiv. And our Mishnah didn't have that extra clause. Amar of Papa, no. It's not necessarily against Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. As hacha, we're talking about a case, b'nitar beidariaski. We're talking about where you watch it for all the people who live together. Right? Meaning there was Rashi goes through it, but there was a case where, 5 people had fields together. It didn't make any sense for one of them, each one to make a hay pile in their own field and have to watch it from animals. So they would do it together. They would have a what do we call it? A communist kind of thing, right? A commune. And they would come together and they would put it in one person's field, right? And therefore, since they said, Ayol v'gadosh, they said, come up and put your hay pile in my field. That's the equivalent to Ayol v'entar lachu. That's the equivalent to saying, bring it up into my field and I will watch it for you. So in this particular case, which is our Mishnah's case, even Rebbe would agree that the person whose field it's in has to watch it if they agree to do that. And if they don't, then they're patur. And we will stop there and go tomorrow. We will start. I don't know who's doing it tomorrow. I guess we'll see in the WhatsApp, but start from that second Mishnah.
Yasher Koach.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful week.
Yeah,
Miriam, when are you coming home?
Shavua tov.
Miriam, when are you coming back?
Bli neder next Tuesday.
Okay.
Safe travel.
Well, safe travels. We'll see you before that, I hope. Shavua
Thank
tov,
you.
everyone.
I mean, we'll see.
We'll see.